(1803). The village of Hammersmith was a quiet, rural outpost, mostly surrounded by dark woods and unlit roads. It makes for a perfect setting for the supernatural. The lane's narrow bends, overhanging trees, and deep shadows lend themselves to misinterpretation, especially at night. So it might be easy to see how stories of a white spectre haunting the roads of Black Lion Lane began to take hold. When mist drifts low and the darkness seems to move of its own accord, a flash of pale fabric, the glint of moonlight on fog, or a startled glimpse of a lone figure could quickly harden into something more sinister once retold. Over time, these fleeting impressions were woven into local folklore, passed from one traveller to the next, until the ghost became as much a part of the road as the hedgerows and ruts themselves. Some described it as a spirit with horns and dead glassy eyes, a malevolent spirit with a ghostly white visage. But for some, it wasn't just sightings. According to local news reports, a pregnant woman heading home at night had decided to cross the grounds near the churchyard. It is here that she would encounter the ghost of Hammersmith. Said to have risen from behind a tombstone, the woman was overcome with fear before fainting. Later, the neighbours would find her and return her home, but unfortunately, she would never recover. She passed away only a few days later from shock. Reports also mention a wagon driver with 8 horses pulling a carriage with 16 people on board. It was crossing the grounds near the churchyard. Once again, the figure had risen from the tombstone, scaring the driver and sending him into a panicked frenzy, abandoning the horses and passengers. The villagers soon settled on an explanation. The previous year, a man had taken his own life in the village, an act that, under the customs and laws of the time, marked him as damned. Suicide barred the body from burial in consecrated ground, and so he was laid to rest on a cold northern edge of the churchyard, set apart from the faithful and just. To many in Hammersmith, this separation mattered. The north side was thought to be a place of shadow and exclusion, reserved for those who had been denied salvation. As fear took hold, people began to say the man's soul could not rest, that it had risen from a dishonoured grave to wander graveyards and roads at night, driven not by sorrow, but by vengeance. However, the fear did not remain for long, and as panic spread, it curdled into opportunity. Neighbours gathered what money they could spare and pooled it together, placing a cash reward on the ghost itself. Whoever could seize the apparition or destroy it would receive the reward. With that promise, the night streets changed. They were no longer occupied by shuttered homes and anxious families hurrying indoors. Armed men began to appear instead, roaming the lanes with muskets and clubs, emboldened by the thought of recognition and reward. What had begun as a shared fear now drew out a different kind of beast. Men hunting, not just for safety, but for glory, for gold. Thomas Millwood, a 22-year-old bricklayer, was a man grounded in reality, with little patience for ghost stories or superstition. In the early 1800s, his profession demanded a very specific attire: white linen trousers, a white flannel waistcoat, and a white apron. From head to toe, he was clad in stark, blinding white, a uniform designed for work, but one that, in the dark, could easily be mistaken for something far more sinister. It was the night of January 3rd, 1804. Thomas sat in his parents' home, the hour late and the house cloaked in shadow. Outside, the streets were in complete darkness. At 10 o'clock, as he readied himself to walk home to his wife, his mother-in-law glanced at him and felt an uneasy chill creep over her. There was nothing in him that should have caused alarm, and yet somehow, in that quiet, black night, he seemed otherworldly. She shook her head and warned him. Thomas, put on a greatcoat. In that outfit, you look like the ghost. Thomas chuckled at her concern. He said he was a solid, sturdy man, accustomed to hard work and darker corners of life than a shadowy lane. Fear had no place in him, yet even as he laughed, the warning lingered in the air. He stepped out into the night, the door closing softly behind him, and into the inky gloom of Black Lion Lane. The street was silent, but that silence was deceiving. Unseen eyes watched, hands gripped weapons, hearts pounded with a mix of terror and anticipation. Thomas had no inkling that with each step he had encountered a tinderbox of fear, the place where every shadow was armed, every movement could spark a deadly mistake. He was walking straight into what was, in all but name, a den of bloodthirsty wolves, and he looked like the meat. One of these wolves was Francis Smith. Smith was an excise officer. Witnesses would later describe him as good of character, calm and mild-mannered. He was no thug, no bully prowling the streets for trouble. He was an ordinary citizen gripped by fear, convinced that he had a duty to defend the village from the sinister shape that haunted its lanes. By 10:30, Smith had seized a shotgun, loaded it with birdshot, and made his intentions known to the few patrons lingering in the White Hart pub. "If I see it," he said, "voice steady, I shall speak to it, and if it does not answer, I shall fire." Then he stepped into Black Lion Lane. The silence was heavy, oppressive, pressing down on every nerve. Every shadow seemed to twitch, every sound, however small, seemed magnified in the gloom. Smith walked forward, unaware that what he was about to collide with was a fate far more terrifying than any ghost story. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the mist, ghost-like and towering, draped in stark white from head to toe. It was Thomas Millwood, unaware of the danger that lay ahead. Smith's heart leapt. He raised his shotgun with trembling hands, eyes straining to pierce through the gloom. "Damn you! Who are you?" he bellowed into the darkness. "Stand or I'll shoot." The fog thickened around them, swallowing sound and light, turning a routine winter night into a stage for terror. In that instant, the villagers' fear, the whispered stories, the bounties, the restless ghosts of rumour, all converged in a single moment. There would later be mixed testimonies, as Smith claimed he shouted twice, but the watchman, William Girdler, who was nearby, testified that the shot came instantly. Thomas Millwood likely never even processed the threat. He probably thought Smith was just a drunk shouting at the moon. He didn't stop, and unfortunately, he had taken one step too many. The white figure crumpled. Smith ran forward, expecting to find a demon. Instead, he found a young bricklayer shot through the jaw and chest, his white apron slowly turning red. The ghost was just a man. Francis Smith, in his panic, surrendered immediately. He was distraught, pacing back and forth, realizing the monster was a neighbour. The trial, formerly known as Rex v. Smith, would go on to capture the public's imagination, becoming one of the most talked about cases of the early 1800s. It centered on a legal question that would echo through the centuries and is still studied by law schools today: the doctrine of mistake of fact. Smith's defense was straightforward, if unusual. "I believed I was confronting a ghost," he explained. "I acted in self-defense against a supernatural threat." The prosecution met him with cold logic. "Ghosts do not exist," they declared. "You cannot claim self-defense against what is not real." The jury, however, could not ignore the character of the man before them. They saw a citizen of good nature, a man who had acted out of fear rather than malice. Though the outcome was tragic, the verdict reflected the sympathy. Smith was found guilty of manslaughter, a lesser charge than murder, a recognition that even a well-intentioned mistake could carry fatal consequences. But the presiding judge, Lord Chief Baron MacDonald, was enraged. He could not abide by the jury's leniency. His fury was not merely about the letter of the law, and targeted the fragile order of society itself. He knew that the streets of Hammersmith were filled with armed citizens, each ready to take law into their own hands. "You cannot kill an innocent person because you mistakenly believed you were in danger," he declared, "especially if that belief is founded on superstition." MacDonald made his position clear. To excuse Smith's actions would be to open the floodgates to chaos. If one man could shoot at shadows and claim innocence, every town in England could erupt into the same lethal panic. He forced the jury to return to the box. Hours later, worn and uneasy, they came back with the only verdict consistent with the law: guilty of murder. The sentence: death. The trial concluded on a Saturday. By the judge's decree, Smith was to hang on Monday morning. Less than 48 hours remained. His body was to be handed over to surgeons for dissection. The news would ignite into a public frenzy. Outraged citizens flooded letters to King George III, demanding mercy. Messengers galloped through the darkened streets, racing against time. From the courthouse to the palace, carrying ink-stained appeals that could mean life or death for Francis. Then, at the very last possible moment, salvation arrived. A royal pardon was granted. Smith's sentence was commuted to 1 year of hard labour. He would live. Yet even with his life spared, the shadow of a tragedy had left its stain. Death had been narrowly avoided, but the consequence of fear and superstition, the ghostly panic that had consumed an entire village, they were far from over. For a time, the villagers continued to whisper of a ghost roaming the lanes, convinced that the roads were haunted by a restless spirit. But the truth was far less spectral and far more human. A local shoemaker, John Graham, was overheard one night, drinking in a tavern, his laughter carrying over the sounds of the pub. He bragged openly about how he had terrified the village and delighted in the fear that he had sown. A witness, alarmed by his audacity, reported him to the magistrates. When they arrested Graham, they discovered the source of the terror: a simple white blanket, crudely patterned into crisscross lines. The ghost was nothing more than fabric and human mischief. Under questioning, Graham admitted the whole scheme. There had been no restless spirit avenging a suicide. His intent was far more mundane: to frighten his apprentices, who were already prone to believing in ghosts. He would lurk behind tombstones in the churchyard, the very same churchyard where Thomas Millwood now rested, and spring out at passers-by for a laugh. The legend that had gripped Hammersmith was a product of prank, panic, and superstition, not the supernatural. And then came the final, cruel twist of justice. Thomas Millwood lay dead at 22, his young life cut short, leaving behind a pregnant wife who would never see her husband again. Francis Smith, who had pulled the trigger in fear and confusion, had faced the scaffold itself. His freedom and reputation shattered, his soul weighed with the knowledge of a life taken, even if by mistake. And John Graham, the shoemaker, whose thoughtless prank had sparked it all? The man whose white sheet had ignited a panic that led directly to Thomas's death and Smith's near execution? Well, he faced only a charge of causing a nuisance. He paid a small fine and walked away, free to return to his life, leaving behind a village forever marked by fear, superstition, and tragedy. Looking back at the Hammersmith ghost today, I can't help but to wonder, what would have become of Francis Smith if he had fired at the ghost in the modern era? In 1804, the court applied what is now called an objective test. The judge's reasoning was simple and rigid. A reasonable person does not believe in ghosts. Therefore, your fear was unreasonable. Therefore, you are guilty. Smith's genuine terror counted for little against the cold logic of the law. But the legal landscape has changed over the centuries. Through cases like this, the law gradually evolved, giving rise in many jurisdictions to a subjective test. Today, the question would not be whether ghosts exist, but whether the defendant genuinely believed he was in danger. If a modern jury concluded that Smith honestly thought he was confronting a threat to his life, a monstrous figure in the fog, he might have walked free. It took nearly 200 years for the law to catch up to the tragedy of Black Lion Lane, to recognise the human fear and panic that had collided with superstition and misjudgment, and to offer the possibility of justice, measured with understanding rather than blind reason. Thomas Millwood was laid to rest in All Saints Churchyard in Hammersmith. The Hammersmith ghost case established a dark precedent in the law. Fear is not an excuse for murder. It reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the dark isn't a ghost. It's the fear of one